Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero. Our guest today is John Murphy, who was on the show just a couple of weeks ago. He was a military intelligence analyst and elite operative in Vietnam, who came on the show with writer-director John Ryder to talk about their film Agents Unknown. It tells Lieutenant Murphy's story in a way that reveals how the collapse of trust and the infiltration of spy networks led to corrupted intelligence that went all the way up the chain of command and became war policy. And if we think we've overcome that challenge today, well, co-hosting with Pete for this episode is Bill Mankins, who's been on the show before as well. Bill and Pete are fellow intel operators who served in a variety of intelligence functions, and the three men talk about how the craft of intel has changed over the decades and across cultural lines, and the obstacles that remain the same. This is a discussion you can't really hear anywhere else. You can get more about John Murphy at agentsunknown.com and more about Bill Mankins at mankinsresearch.org. For now, here's today's guest, John Murphy.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hey, my name is John Murphy, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, John was on part one, I guess, of this conversation. He's in a documentary called Agents Unknown. It covers his time in Vietnam as an intel guy, as an advisor to the Vietnamese. And just, I was struck when I watched the documentary that him and Mike Ryder made in the similarities between his mission 50 plus years ago in Vietnam and what my co-host and I have gone through. And of course, my co-host today is a former show guest and a long time friend of mine. He and I did the same kind of work in Afghanistan. I did some in Iraq as well. But basically similar things where we're advising the U.S. forces, U.S. elements on what reality is and how we, what's capable, what capacity is available to the Afghans, to the Iraqis, to the Vietnamese. So a lot of similarities, and I thought it might be interesting, and certainly not something that's commonly captured in the greater media sphere, to have really three real field warriors tell you kind of how they approached an impossible job that, as much as everybody wants to get us trained up and ready to go, it's just not something that's easily accomplished. So thank you, fellas, for coming on. Bill, I wanted to give you the first question. When I describe how ill-prepared we were, how did you manage to actually accomplish your mission on a day-to-day basis? Because you did incredible things.
I actually had a huge benefit than in many ways than what you guys did. And as I just learned about John getting thrown in right out of undergrad, in that before I went, I had done all of my PhD coursework in Central Asian studies and specifically about Afghanistan. And so I had a decent speaking ability of the four main languages in the area and a good historical background and cultural background of the area before going, and then the military stuff before that. So in general, I will say I felt probably much more prepared than you guys did, and at the same time was actually not remotely as prepared as what I wanted to be, could have been, or should have been, and of course never as good at the beginning as at the end. So.
And then what about you, John? Same kind of question. You talked about kind of being a neophyte when you got out there, but surely you had some kind of preparation or some kind of knack. Can you describe what that was when you first got to Vietnam?
I'm hard put to find any kind of expertise. That Bill's experience is marvelous. That's, I think, what a lot of us thought we should have had when we got there. Now, to tell you the truth, the fact of the matter was I got caught up when I entered the service in the big call-up. Everybody was going to Vietnam. And I think, as I mentioned, probably in the podcast and in our last, and in the documentary, when we were training as so-called combat intelligence operators, there was nothing about Vietnam to speak of. This was in May of 1966, and we'd already begun really the build-up there. But when I got to Saigon in October of 1966. We had a few people who'd been there for a few months before us, and we got as quickly as possible a kind of an update on what they were doing. As it turned out, I was going to be doing something none of them were doing. They were assigned to basically to MACV's general headquarters at Tan Son Nhut, and we're in the big Pentagon East phase of looking at the war from the broadest possible angle, while I was going to be sent out to what we call the field, and as we know, wound up at the province level, being told I was now an advisor to the Vietnamese after 6 weeks of combat training and 6 weeks of intelligence training, none of which prepared me for the experience.
Wow. I got a question for you, John, about the district versus, sort of province. I don't know if yours was broken down further into district, but the provincial level versus, MACV headquarters. In watching the documentary, and in our experiences too, there's just a world of difference between the way that the headquarters and the headshed for the country saw things versus what was happening at the district level. And if you could just talk a little bit about that in terms of your 6 week, prep and what you were ready for or not ready for, how they had trained you to work at the province versus training people to work at the headquarters level at that time in '66. It may have been different in '72 or something.
Well, that's it. Yeah. Just a background on that, just quickly, the way I wound up going to the field, as we were told by our counterparts. A little background: there'd been a group of us that had been through Fort Benning and then through Fort Holabird's intelligence training. We were waiting for assignment. We all knew we were going overseas to Vietnam, but we were waiting at Fort Bragg. We'd have to report in every day and to see if there were orders. And then finally one day, somebody comes in and says, well, we need 20 people to go next week. And so all of the single people sort of volunteered, and those of us, I had just been married for a month and a half. So wow. They volunteered to go, and the rest of us had a couple more weeks of kind of nothing to do. And finally, we were told we were on our way. We were in the last group, as far as I know, to be shipped to Vietnam by ship. We went to Oakland Harbor.
Wow.
And then to San Diego and took on 3,000 Marines. Our ship, I'll never forget, the USS Gordon. We had 3,000 young Marines headed for the I Corps and some terrible stuff. And there were 12 of us second lieutenants in the Army intelligence. And the first thing that happened was the colonel who headed the Marines wanted a meeting with our senior officer.
Oh my gosh.
Well, we had to all check our dates of being sworn in to see which of us was the senior. And the meeting was, how are we going to divide up the ship between 12 Army officers and 3,000 Marines? They wanted half, but they didn't want their Marines to come in contact with the Army. Well, anyway, we get to Vietnam, and the guys that we had sent ahead said, oh, you guys, we're sorry, you got trouble, well, what's going on? Well, sometime a week or two before, the General McChristian, the head of Army intelligence, had come through, and when he looked at the people in Saigon, he said, what the hell you got all these people in Saigon for? Let's get them out to the field. And it turned out we were the ones. And then the next batch to come in, and so we were going to the field. So instead of being at our big maps looking at movement and trying to identify NVA units or something, all of a sudden I was going to be out advising the Vietnamese, as you say, at the province level. Now, just to describe that province, there were the 4 corps that you may know of that the Vietnam was divided into, and within them, each of them, I think there were 44 provinces altogether. maybe a few more. But anyway, each province was then subdivided into districts. We are at Ninh Thuan province had 4 districts. And then, of course, within each of those districts, there were villages, which were, I suppose, something more comparable to our counties. And then within those were a variety of hamlets. And so that was the breakdown. And at the province level, at that time, there were no specific intelligence people at the district level or lower, except for people who might be operating out of the province. So for the most part, we were the lowest on the totem pole of intelligence collection at that time.
When you guys were doing your day-to-day work at the province, how far disconnected were you from I-Corps or from MATV and the higher elements? I know on our end, you could write a report and see the remnants of your report boiled down to a line or two and taken completely out of context and really in no way accurate. Did you guys have a similar kind of thing as you processed all your paperwork?
You know, except for the idea that we actually saw much of our work, our job was, of course, twofold, which was to find out what the Vietnamese knew and then send it up the line. I never had really much contact with which would have been 2 Corps headquarters, which was in Pleiku. Had a little bit more contact with the division, the division headquarters, which was at Ban Me Tuot. And there I had a friend who'd been assigned there, and so we had some contact. And partially because of another strange little element of the Army's working, as a junior officer at the province level, and you may have seen this in the documentary, I was 3 times assigned to be the pay run officer, as we called it, having to fly around the southern part of 2 Corps, paying other advisors. And so I did get to a little bit to know some of the other areas. But in general, the closest I came to knowing our reports was when I would get to Saigon and we would be briefed on the sort of overall situation. And I think I've mentioned before, I had the opportunity to tell my colleagues there that they had a beautiful map. They had some beautiful ideas of what was going on. The only problem was that I sent the information and I knew it was bullshit. So that was their only problem.
I want to just, for the audience's sake, a division is, let's say, 25 to 30,000 people. It's a bunch of brigades, and the brigades are made up of a bunch of battalions. Battalions are like 1,000 people each. I'm doing really approximate numbers for Army stickler folks.
Yeah, let me just say that in our time, there were separate brigades, but in this area, the division really referred to the Vietnamese divisions. And each of those divisions was broken down with units that were at the province level. You had kind of a parallel military government at the province level. The province chief was a colonel, and the officers in most of the cases were military officers that actually ran the province. So when I talk about the division, it was the 23rd ARVN Division, and they had their headquarters in Ban Me Tuot, and their size was probably smaller than what the typical American unit is, especially now.
Gotcha. And then the other thing that he's talking about is being a pay officer, and that's exactly what you would think it might be. He's going to go to a higher headquarters, sign for a bag of money. John Murphy now owns this $30,000, and then he's going to go out like the goddamn mailman with cash and have someone else sign for their cash. And that's how people got paid in a deployed environment back then. So on top of his regular job where you have to maintain relationships, and I'll ask you in a second, John, this question, but he would have to take off for an undetermined amount of time and take on all this responsibility because that cash really belonged to John, and he was really supposed to give it to everybody and show a paper that happened. So it's a big endeavor, and it absolutely takes all of your time and attention. How long would these pay runs take, John?
Well, on a good run, it might be only 3 or 4 days, maybe 5. But as one of the stories in the documentary is, it took a little longer because our plane crashed and we had a little difficulty completing that, along with a variety of other bureaucratic issues, which ought to be unbelievable, but are. It's funny you mentioned that the pay run. Remember that the military believed that, I don't know if this was true in Afghanistan. Maybe you ran across it, but the army was insistent that all of its members get paid as close to their regular payday as possible. It was a morale factor. And so that's why we would take off a couple of days before payday and try to be to as many places by payday as possible. And the money that we took were, of course, not dollars, but military payment certificates and piastres, because piastres were the French derivative monies that the Vietnamese were using at the time. And so you couldn't get paid in actual dollars, but only in the MPCs or piastres. And that was another exchange. We were a regular banking outfit. Each individual would decide how much of their MPCs they'd like to convert to piastres. And here I am trying to figure out what the going ratio was of piastres to the dollar MPC. So
I got a question for you, John. On the you said one of the main goals was to find out what the Vietnamese knew, and I'm curious the way that was set up. At least again at that time that you were there, was it finding out what your ARVN counterparts knew, or the civilian Vietnamese civilian government counterparts knew, the sort of State Department counterpart, if you will, or was it individual local people outside of government, or all of the above?
Well, we didn't have a lot of direct contact with the civilian population. We operated primarily through the ARVN military. And so I had a counterpart who was there, what we call the S2, the intelligence officer for the province. He had at his disposal an intelligence reconnaissance squad, many of whom had been doing this for many, many years. And the idea was that we would develop a relationship with with our counterpart. I did also have a senior officer over me for most of the year. I was a second lieutenant, then a first lieutenant. I was a captain, and then a major, Richard Culp, that was my superior, who was the actual S2. And we would work with them usually on a daily basis. We would write reports that were based to a large extent on information that they collected. Now, there were other intelligence operatives in the area, some of which we knew and some of which we didn't know. The National Police were guided primarily by individuals from the Central Intelligence Agency. They operated a separate network, and we sometimes were able to coordinate with them and sometimes not. I tell the story in the documentary of how badly that worked. We were called to Phan Rang after an explosion in an apartment building where 2 men were killed and one, potentially a Viet Cong, who was trying to get away from the building. It wasn't until several days later when a plane of officials from Saigon, that we later identified as Central Intelligence, could confirm to us that the 2 people that had been blown up were, in fact, 2 of their agents who worked as cover out of the Air Force Base, about whom we knew nothing, even at the time that they were killed. So that kind of relationship was somewhat tenuous at best. There also was a number of course, American sources, what we called special agent reports that we would get from basically security agency, communications kinds of intelligence that were, from our standpoint, the most reliable. we would try to pull those things together with any kind of human reports and put them into daily and then weekly and monthly, whatever reports we sent up to higher headquarters.
So to follow up on that, one of the things that in any kind of complex environment is that who takes the lead on what issues, and when in the war different people or different organizations have taken the lead. And you described a little bit in a way sort of how the Intel network was divvied up between sort of CIA network running the National Police at that time, and you guys working mostly through the ARVN and your parallel counterparts, and the special agent stuff from the SIGINT folks. Where you were in at that provincial level, did you find that from an intelligence standpoint, that the intelligence was being sort of a coordinated effort, or did you find that the CIA was running one war and DoD was running another, and sort of maybe NSA was working yet another one? Or how much coordination was there in 66 to 67 at the provincial level?
Well, you raised several points there that are kind of stick in my craw. The first regarding the coordination was that there really was none, and our job was to try to persuade the Vietnamese to share with each other. We couldn't tell whether the national police sources were the same as the one that ARVN had or that somebody else had. We couldn't get a kind of coordination that led us, because nobody trusted anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to what was really the precursor to the Phoenix program, which you may have heard about.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of identifying Viet Cong infrastructure, that is sort of the civilian component who were part of a kind of parallel province that would be in position to take over if the Viet Cong had taken over the province, and to identify those people and to eliminate them one way or another. And the first step of that was to try to get coordination of the information from the Vietnamese sources. And typical in American fashion, the first this idea, as we were finally briefed on it, was brought to President Thieu, and he decided no, he didn't want to push on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So the American military, not wanting to appear to be colonial rulers or to insist upon anything, brought those of us who were Army intelligence officers to Saigon for training. And what the training basically was how we were going to, at the local level, persuade our counterparts to provide this kind of coordination. And after that developed, the American higher-ups could then just tell the Vietnamese that this was already in place. Well, if you've dealt with a kind of military organization like the Vietnamese had, you know that they don't do anything unless they're ordered by somebody right above them to do it. And the idea that we were going to persuade them to reveal their sources to one another was simply beyond anything that we ever accomplished. Now, whether people afterwards were able to get something together, I don't know. But my second point, I kind of blow my own horn, although it's also kind of typical of the military at the time, and either of you maybe have quite the same experience, I hope. But anyway, when I was at the Army Intelligence School, which was after my tour in Vietnam, and I had written a block of instruction about Vietnam that was the first one that anybody at the school had ever seen, I became identified as the Vietnam expert. So one day I was called in by the superintendent of the school, who handed me a letter from the British intelligence services. I've forgotten the name now of the military outfit. But anyway, the letter was probably a 3-page analysis of the problems of intelligence coordination and collection in Vietnam as the British saw it. And the colonel asked me then to draft a response to it. And what I found in the analysis provided by the British was, of course, much to my what I had found in my experience, that is this lack of coordination, the fact that the services wouldn't talk to each other, et cetera. And I decided to write a fairly candid response in which I admitted as much and said that, on the other hand, it wasn't totally surprising because we had found it difficult to even coordinate with our own American services. And so I passed this off to the colonel's office, and 2 days later I get a call saying to report immediately to the colonel's office.
Of
well,
course.
I'm sure now I'm going to get reamed out for this response. And the colonel says, "Did you write this?" I said, "Yes, sir, I did." He said, "Do you realize it's 2 days late?" I said, "Sorry, sir, I worked very hard on." Well, he says, "Don't let it happen again." And that was the end of the discussion of my so-called candid memo back to the British.
The fact that it was late. Yeah.
Yeah. All he worried about was it was late.
Let's put in some baseline knowledge here. When services work together, even just different elements, different units within the U.S. military, we don't want to share things. In particular, we don't share our source identity. We might code them with a number or something like that, but it's something that you absolutely don't share. And so it in no way surprises me that we were trying to create this, and my question's not going to be related to this. I'm just trying to put some clarity in. It doesn't surprise me that the military wanted the Vietnamese to do something that they themselves weren't willing to do, nor were they willing to share that information with the Vietnamese. So that's also hilarious. If
I could just make one more point. The other kind of major point I'd make from that is it was instructive of how, and I think appropriately, I mean, the really horns of my analysis of the whole Vietnam War are hinged on this. The only way that we could have, quote, won the war was to take it over and run it. And yet that means you'd never won it.
Right.
That means you were just another colonial power or something. And the American military, even at the highest levels, I think were reluctant to try to pressure the political leadership of Vietnam on some of these things because they did not want to appear to be, another colonial power. And so it's a very difficult, and maybe you ran into that with the Afghans as well. I mean, how do you preserve the autonomy of the local people? How do they develop their own system for deciding things, for making policy, et cetera, while at the same time trying to coax them into what you think will be the most helpful directions?
Yeah, boy, it's super hard. Bill and I were talking, as we were prepping for this episode, and there was a thing called the RIAA. The RIAA, it was basically a regional analysis of how we were doing with our various goals for the region. Hospitals, military proficiency, governance, all the different ministries. And it always struck me, and because I got to stay through several units and I housed a lot of that knowledge, we would sit down dutifully. Everybody would forget you had to do this thing, and it'd be like, oh my God, we have to turn this hyper-important article up to the higher, and we have to assess our area so we can decide what tranche we're going to be in. A tranche for the audience is just a phase line. It's the next part of the operation or story. And so we would sit down, and I would raise my hand and say, we're evaluating all of the Afghan governance and different elements. How come there are no Afghans in the room? Oh, well, this meeting is classified. It's they're not allowed to be in here. But these guys really are actually going to be in charge of this stuff. It would be important if they were a part of this conversation. Could we just make it not classified? Oh no, we just have to get this done and send it to higher. And then to make it all worse, John, is I remember sitting there. There's a brigade commander, a colonel with a big bird on his collar for the audience. He's almost a general. Sure. That's his next step. And he's like, okay, give me hospitals for this district. And they're like, oh, sir, there are none. Well, but you're giving it a go. You're giving hospitals a go, but there's no hospitals. And so the deputy commander, the DCO, leans back to the commander and says, sir, in this district, we've lowered the bar. Roger, bar's lowered. Okay, good. Go on hospitals. and that's sort of
you mentioned
the modern
hospitals.
take on that.
I have a story about hospital. We had one provincial hospital with 2 Vietnamese doctors.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
Reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner,
or at JohnLG69.
at The Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
I have a story about hospital. We had one provincial hospital with 2 Vietnamese doctors. And because we were responsible, we were the sort of go-betweens with the Vietnamese by all American units. Phan Rang Air Base had a major Air Force component there that flew out every day and bombed and strafed primarily in the I Corps area. But anyway, we got called out because there was a problem that they thought we should help with. And the problem was that at night, under the barbed wire, too many of the Air Force were crawling out to get to the prostitute hamlet across the way, and they were getting shot at by their own soldiers. And so they wanted us to move it. They wanted us to get the Vietnamese to move it. Well, that wasn't going to happen.
No.
But they said the second problem was, of course, venereal diseases. And so they wanted us to get the Vietnamese doctor, of the 2 that served the entire province, to come out once a week to treat the young women in this little village area. And we said, look at, we've got 2 doctors for the entire. We were supported by some Air Force doctors who were in a different assignment that resided with us in the advisory group, but they were completely overworked with the problems of civilians in the province. I said, why don't you just get one of your doctors to go and treat them? Well, they said, oh my God, what would happen if this got to the press in the United States that we were treating prostitutes so that our men could have access to them?
Yeah.
So we worked out a deal. And the deal was one afternoon a week, sure enough, a Vietnamese doctor would come out to treat the young women. And 2 Air Force doctors would go to the province hospital and treat Vietnamese civilians. And by the way, you can have all the penicillin you ever wanted. So that was our solution to one of the hospital problems in our province.
I wanted to ask you the training to convince your Vietnamese partners to share their sources and their intel. Again, something that we hate to do ourselves. What was that training? What did it consist of? Like, what was their genius idea? I can't wait to hear it.
Well, the genius idea was to set up what we called a centralized tactical operations center, where there'd be representatives of each of the various agencies sort of working together, a talk of some sort that would somehow bring them together. But most of it was simply, what we were simply told to do was to rationally explain why this was a good idea, why it was necessary in order to be sure that our information was correct and the like. And there really was no trick or no special kind of secret that we were given to try to do it. We were just left to our own devices. And we didn't succeed, by the way, very successfully.
What a surprise.
We did physically, I think, establish a room that was to serve as the talk. And I think we had occasional appearances by different people, usually more of a sharing of their information, or at least some of it, but not sharing of their sources. So it made it very difficult to try to make some sense of it.
Hey,
It was after I left that, these became more sophisticated, and you had the blossoming, I guess you'd call it, of the Phoenix program, where um, the one area that may have contributed to that was that we had an operation that did overrun the local province Viet Cong headquarters, and we had hundreds of pages of information, which took a very long time to get translated, and which did identify a number of the cadre that would eventually perhaps be the objects of an operation. But by that time, 365 days to the day, I was rotated away, and I have no idea what happened then.
Yeah, that's another great point. I know from my own direct experience, all of these ideas were rehashed over and over again, and a program that had failed to be completed within that unit's year would be reanimated back into life. And it was this stuff that was it was purely focused on that military enabler's goal set. So let's say I'll beat up on the agricultural guys. Like the goat inoculation program. We're going to get that going in this valley. It had been going 5 different times. The question was never, how come we're struggling to keep this goat program going? How come we can't get the Ministry of Agriculture to take this over? It was always, let's get this thing going, and the last guys must have screwed it up. So in ag, one of the things they would do was go out and give classes to pomegranate farmers, because we were in a pomegranate area, and they would teach these guys who already grow this crop how to grow it with no idea, John, of the market chain. Like, we're going to help you get more money. Well, how do they get money? And that was my job. Like, find out. Let's find out the market chain. And they're like, oh, well, first off, we all co-op and we rent a truck and we all bring in the harvest together. There's no amount of harvest that we can't bring in this valley. We'll never hire outside. Meanwhile, the State Department's briefing, let's get their crop yield up so that they hire people from the outside. Never going to happen. Not how they did it.
Yeah.
That must unlock some stuff for you.
Well, there are a couple of things there. The one that maybe we come back to, what I tried to understand as I came back and looked back at the experience, was the extent to which, and it may be a kind of an American kind of approach, but the U.S. Army thought that you could cure problems of motivation, ambition, honesty, whatever, if you could only put the Vietnamese into the correct organizational structure. If you could organize them in some fashion. And the idea of this Tactical Operations Center was sort of around that. I mean, if we could get them all to sit around and be responsible for a joint operation, then they would somehow change their behaviors that they developed over all these years. The second one, and I'm not sure whether the story is in the documentary, but again, one of my favorites, is one day being brought out to a hamlet. We went out to a hamlet that was part of the early strategic hamlet program, which had been started in about 1962. And it was, again, the idea of trying to organize a defense around certain hamlets and hold those areas. But this one, it turned out, as I looked around the town, I noticed that there was about a 2-foot high cement slab platform that went around, a nice area in the center of the hamlet. And lo and behold, at one corner of this structure, a little platform, if you will, was a plaque. And the plaque said, this marketplace is a gift from the President, from the United States of America, in honor of the visit of the Honorable Dean Rusk in some date. And so I asked my interpreter, and Pete, you and I have talked a little bit about this. You have to rely on interpreters to try to understand some of these things. But anyway, I said to my interpreter, go around and find out what this is all about. What was the story with Russ? Because people are just sitting around on this platform. Well, he comes back and he kind of giggled a little bit. He said, when Russ came, he called the Hamlet chief over and he asked the Hamlet chief what the Hamlet chief would like the United States to do for the Hamlet. And the Hamlet chief said they would like to be the marketplace for the village. And so let it be done. They built the platform. And of course, belying the fact that this was not the marketplace for the village, it was at another hamlet, and it wasn't going to change just because you built a platform for it.
No?
So
the hell you say?
It's a kind of a testimony to our ignorance of the culture and of the history and of all that so much.
On that, you bring up a great point about organizational structure and the desire to import efficient cultures or efficient structures that we have here to a place that doesn't recognize them or have any background in them, that took decades of evolution here, and somehow think a click of the fingers is going to make them happen overnight somewhere else. In that way, I'm going to turn this a little bit to a politics question. When you, in the training they provided you, and then your assessment there of the ARVN and their motivations and the people and the hamlets like you went and saw, again, kind of specific to your province, was there a distinction that you saw between kind of, when I say us and them, I mean, when you think about identity politics and you say, there's the we and the they, and there's always various levels of we and they, us and them, and where people drew those, I don't know. In my experience, I've found that this is often because it's political by nature. People would say like, oh, it's Taliban versus everybody else, or early in Afghanistan, we called the enemy the AAF, the anti-Afghan forces, and you're like, wait a minute, but they're Afghans themselves, so clearly they're not anti-Afghan. What you mean is something different than what you're saying. And so I'm just curious, the way that your province shook out, how did local people, and then how did the ARVN distinguish them from other people? Was it simply who was paying them, or was it by, racial issues, or was it the Catholic, Buddhist divide, or what segments occurred?
Yeah. It's a good question, very good question, but not one that I'm sure I have an answer to. In a sense, a lot of different things were at play. First of all, I have to, kind of the background on the province was probably fairly different than a lot of the other areas where there was a high degree of fighting. We were kind of off the beaten path, even though we were along the seacoast and just south of Cameron Bay. And so the major issues were guerrilla warfare. There was no real NVA presence except for what we called fillers. We found that the North Vietnamese would sometimes be sending in people from the north, not as units, but as individuals to help fill in Viet Cong squads or small units. And a lot of what the activity was involved these small units coming into a hamlet at night, doing some kind of indoctrination session, maybe threatening the hamlet chief or the people for not cooperating with the Americans, sometimes executing somebody as an example, that kind of thing. And what you got the sense of from, again, a really naive American standpoint was that most of the people just wanted to be left alone. They were happy to see the Americans, especially if we brought rice and something to the hamlet, or the kids would like the candy and that kind of thing, and they hide G.I. Joe and that kind of stuff. So you didn't get a lot of hostility that was obvious, and so you didn't know what the real underlying sympathies were. My own sense, I think, came to the idea that this really was to some extent, a Catholic Buddhist issue. The strongest anti-Viet Cong people were generally Catholics, if you explored their background. And they were more in a phase of not so much the Viet Cong, but the associated atheism of communism and that kind of thing. And not that there was a lot of hostility. We also had in our province, the Montagnards, the darker complected people from the Cham or from Cambodian ethnicity and the like, and they were outcasts for the rest of the Vietnamese to a large extent. And so you had a tension there, although not one that ever broke into open hostility during my experience there, but it was clearly one of the kind of elements of it. It did remind me, though, that, and it took me, as we all become sensitized over time, when I realized the district that was primarily occupied by these darker complected ethnic groups had as advisors the two African American officers that I knew in our unit. So,
Is that by design, you think, or is that just a
well,
silly
I think
accident?
so. After I thought about it, I did. Not at the time. It's funny. I didn't make the connection until one of my fellow, actually, interesting, just offhand. I don't want to get into a lot of it, but when my colleagues at the in the advisory group included a number of people who were very bright, very intelligent. In fact, we used to have a seminar basically. My wife had once found that the History Book Club was offering all of Bernard Fall's books, for that $1 or whatever that you could start with the History Book Club. And so a couple of us said, well, that might be interesting to read these and see if we can figure out what he knew and what we're doing wrong. And so it eventually grew into as I say, a small seminar on Saturday nights. We'd have dinner and we'd talk about the war and we'd talk about the readings of Bernard Fall, who happened to get killed while we were over there as well, being blown up along Route 1. Anyway, the point was, one of them was a West Point graduate who had become so soured on the war and what was going on that gave up his career. I mean, there are just some interesting people and the interesting impact that experience had on a number of them. On the other hand, our chief operations officer, S3 advisor, went on to become a general. So there were some interesting kinds of patterns of the military careers of the people that I met there.
One of the things that I learned over the course of time that definitely goes back to Vietnam is the perception that we had to win hearts and minds, and really I found that to be a very poor orientation. Yeah, of course, we need to not be jerks and stuff, but what's paramount was that local government that we were trying to establish, those different institutions. If they couldn't win hearts and minds, if they couldn't establish a norm for the people in the valleys and the villages and the hamlets, then it really didn't matter if anybody gave a damn whether we were there or not, because we were letting down our partners who were going to be holding the bag. In our case, maybe in 6 weeks, maybe in 6 months, but for sure in the very near future, they were going to be running the show with a whole lot less support. So, but we were always focused on our Rusk Mall or this taxi stand or whatever project it was. Did you find the same thing to be true for you guys out there, that the focus on hearts and minds really needed to be more on the Vietnamese?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that was the going phrase, and I'm sure you heard the sort of military variation of that was just grab them by the balls and their hearts and minds will follow. That.
Yeah.
And we decided really that that was the Viet Cong strategy. That often we were struck by the fact that by introducing fear of cooperating with the ARVN or with the Americans was a very strong motivation for their operation, and a lot of it was based on fear. The other thing about it, though, is that we did try to go to sometimes extraordinary lengths to distance ourselves from being the object of the gratitude of the people. We tried to go through the ARVN, through the Vietnamese. For example, if we did have food, rice particularly, it would always go to the district chief to distribute, not from the Americans, not from, that kind of thing. So, and that led, of course, to one of the other stories that I tell, I think, of the district chief whom we realized was siphoning off a good portion of the rice that was supposed to be going to his popular forces. And we made a considerable effort to get rid of him, challenging up through our circles, through our command, that this guy had to go, he was corrupt, etc. And he eventually, of course, as in one way maybe that the Vietnamese military imitated the Americans, the way we got rid of him was that he was promoted to the Command and General Staff College. So that was the solution. But the real story was that we had a ceremony at his going away, and his district was one that had the majority of the Montagnards, and the Montagnards came streaming out of the mountains for this ceremony. And again, through my interpreter, I asked them to find out what the sense was about this. And he came back and he said, well, they say that he's the best district chief they ever had, that he had helped them develop charcoal kilns, little businesses, and he had been the most sympathetic of any Vietnamese they'd ever dealt with. So here we are, the holy Americans, insisting on getting rid of corruption and probably removing the one guy who had some kind of connection with the people he was in charge of. And I said to the colonel, we should have just been paying him directly. Now, I know you guys must have run into that corruption issue and the issue of who gets paid and what's the line, what are we doing in terms of how do we do this? It's always a question. And I firmly believe that turned out to be my superior, the captain who was above me in rank, who complained to the head of our advisory team, because every month we were paying the province chief out of our intelligence money, and he wanted to know what we were getting for it. And the colonel said, well, don't worry about it, I'm just going to pay him anyway. And I swear that this guy got a lousy efficiency rating from the colonel simply because he spoke up on behalf of sort of maintaining a certain degree of integrity to the use of our funds.
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I'm curious what happened and how earlier you said about the way it changes people's perspective. I got kind of two questions for you. One is, you have this experience as a young JO. You're there, something totally different than where you're from and your life was like before. How did seeing what did you do? Well, you're post-deployment. What was your career afterwards in general? Sort of what happened and the trajectory of your life, and then, how did that, or did it, that experience change your view, or not change your view? That's not the right word. I want to say color your perspective maybe on U.S. domestic politics, or the way that you look at, and I ask this because for me there were so many things that typically thought of sort of before as, oh, this is something, quote, they would do. And then you go through this experience of seeing certain kinds of infighting and certain kinds of incompetence and certain kinds of just, there's the cloak and dagger idea that the CIA knows everything. And then you go see what actually is going on. And you go, well, I mean, there's a smidgens of truth about that, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that's totally different than the way the lore appears. And so I'm curious the way it changed or maybe colored your views about domestic life here.
Well, that is an interesting question. Well, first of all, just to tell you what I wound up doing after I came back, as I mentioned, I spent about a year teaching at the Army Intelligence School, and then returned to what had been my course before that, which was the academic world. I came back to Chicago, to the University of Chicago, where I completed a master's degree in political science, focusing, as it turned out in that case, on the Supreme Court and political behavior of the Supreme Court. So in terms of following up, the only thing I did was that there was this guy who was a veteran of World War II, worked for the RAND Corporation, and who offered a course called Debate on Vietnam. And as I checked around with people, I learned that nobody had ever taken it. And one of the reasons was that this guy, very odd guy, before you could take his graduate level course, you had to write a 3-page paper on your most original thought. And he would then decide whether you were worthy enough to take his course, which, needless to say, as you would know, Bill, kept a few people out of his courses, as you can imagine. Anyway, I decided to go in to talk to him, and probably because, unbeknownst to me at the time, he actually was working on an analysis of Viet Cong interviews, prisoner of war interviews at the RAND Corporation. And on the other hand, he was trained in psychology. And I came and I said, I'm back from Vietnam. I've had a lot of these experiences. I'm sort of trying to thrash through them to figure out how so I fit very nicely into his sort of box of people. And I didn't have to write the paper. And so I took his course. And in that, it was a fascinating time. This would have been in maybe the spring of '69, maybe the winter of '69. But anyway, it was at the time when the Pentagon papers began to break, and some of the RAND papers, the RAND people began to break away from supporting the war. And we spent time analyzing the arguments pro and con, and it was just an interesting part of the experience. But my problem was that I wanted to do American politics. I grew up outside of Boston, and local politics, state politics, federal government. I'd spent a summer in Washington, was bitten by the Potomac fever, and I didn't really want to do Vietnam as a thing. The closest I came to it was an uncompleted doctoral dissertation that was going to be on the social science origins of counterinsurgency policy. I wanted to look at how American academics in the 50s and early 60s had kind of laid the groundwork for this so-called counterinsurgency strategy that I had been part of in Vietnam. I never did finish it. Would have been a good topic, but I went on to take a job teaching American government and politics at a state university here in Illinois and in Chicago, and wound up spending 35 years doing that, which is one of the reasons why, as you note, I don't have any trouble talking about my topics. I have some experience in this game.
If you, it's just a consolation, but if you would have written that fantastic article, that certainly would have been applicable to what guys like Bill and I did, 40 years later. I promise you, we absolutely would have ignored it. And
That's right. Well, the The other thing I missed just to talk about my own failed career was that, well, in the sense of not complete, I had another professor who heard some of these stories that I've been telling about Vietnam and said, don't bother doing a traditional kind. Just write up all these stories. I'll defend you, as me. But he was kind of a kook, and I didn't want to be associated with this as one of his students. So I gave that one up too. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's the sort of. I've spent the rest of my career out here in Chicago. I raised with my beautiful wife, my late wife, 3 children. I have 5 grandchildren now, and I enjoy telling the stories, but that had some impact on my life all the way through. You wouldn't keep telling them, I guess, if they didn't have some kind of importance in your life, and I keep trying to deal with that.
Yeah, well, I think the same thing applies to Bill and I. We're doing our darndest during our professional careers to make at least some subtle change, or at least provide someone the opportunity to read or listen or do something. My writing partner and I just did a resubmit on a peer-reviewed paper that's going to go in on a process that maybe helps us. I would love to talk to you about the cultural training that you received prior to and during deployment, but I already know the answer, that it was minimal at best.
Yeah,
and,
right. It's none.
Yeah, and based upon not screwing it up instead of how to use culture to your advantage. So we're going to have you come back and do more of this.
It's very kind of you. I'd just say for the most important piece that I remember from my intelligence training was the film they showed of the red blot moving across the world. Communism was taking over, and that was about our introduction to any of these things.
Yeah, of course, of course. Yeah,
you guys missed the Cold War. You wouldn't have.
Yeah,
it was an interesting time.
Yeah, interesting time for sure. Bill, any closing thoughts?
I just, it's fascinating talking with you, John. You would love to do it again for sure. I mean, I could go on and on and on for literally hours asking you questions about your experience and your after stuff too. Quite frankly, with that look, I mean, some of the things you were looking at and researching, and some of the things that I'm doing right now, and hopefully in the future we can pick your brain again.
Well, I appreciate that. It's very kind of you to listen to an old man tell his war stories.
Yeah, it's an old wise man, and you've paved a similar road to us. That's why I wanted to have you on. And Bill's not kidding. We met up sort of accidentally in Bagram in Afghanistan, and we stayed up for hours, way past everybody's bedtime, just absolutely having a blast, swapping stories and learning from each other. So he's not kidding. He really could do this for hours, and so could I. But yeah, let's just do another one instead, and hopefully everybody else gets something out of it. And if not, someone someday is going to go, hey, who were these guys, and why do they know so much about going to war and doing things that are decidedly not, like, we're focused on a non-lethal side. We're gathering information. We're helping us to do a better job of being there. And maybe at some point someone will figure some of these things out.
Well, you'd like to hope that we make some progress and stay out of these wars that we can't figure out how to deal with.